Hi, folks. I'm Tim Carter, creator of the Blood and Leather podcast, and I want to welcome you to episode 5. Now, this one deals with Wilson Price Hunt's overland expedition for the American Fur Company and, therefore, for the Pacific Fur Company. This is part 1 of that overland expedition, but it's really part 4 of my review of the fur trade in North America. I started with part 2 of the podcast series, focusing on the explosion of fur trading in Montreal, in Canada, by the French. And then we moved on to part 3, I should say episode 3, where we talked about the explorations inland and those types of things. And we've now progressed to the part where we have established Astoria, Oregon. The American Fur Company, or the Pacific Fur Company, established Astoria, Oregon. And the other half of John Jacob Astor's vision was to have an overland expedition that would move out, cross the Rocky Mountains overland, and meet the seagoing expedition at Astoria. So we're going to focus on the overland aspect of it in this case. And if you haven't heard episodes 2 through 4 of the Blood and Leather podcast, go back and check them out. And that'll kind of help set the stage for this one. And I certainly do hope that you enjoy it. Now, in episode 4, I covered the American Fur Company of John Jacob Astor and his plan, which was really ambitious, for creating a global trade network that would use New York, Astoria, and Canton, China as the 3 major trade ports. In today's episode, episode 5, we're going to continue that work, but focus on that transcontinental route that was taken by Wilson Price Hunt's expedition from Montreal to the shores of the Pacific at Astoria. The hardest part of any job is simply getting started, and Hunt found this out early on. Being much less familiar with this information, I found a lot more that I needed to consider and a lot more that I wanted to discuss than I originally envisioned. Naively, I thought that I would jump into the fur trade and that I would cover really essentially the 1830s, starting with Lewis and Clark, but moving into the 1830s pretty quickly, and discussing sort of the golden age of the fur trade in what is now the United States. But I didn't realize as much about what led to that golden age. I had not studied that very, very thoroughly. And so as I study it, I find so much more that I want to be able to talk about. So I hope that you will stick with me on this and that you'll get as much from it as I did, and that it will be as enlightening for you as it has been for me. Let's get started. Now, when we wrapped up episode 4, John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company, and therefore his American Fur Company, well, they had suffered a tremendous blow. The explosion of the Tonkin, the ship, the supply ship and trading ship that Astor had bought, intending to sail it between New York, Astoria, and Canton, China, it had been blown up by one of the members of the crew in the Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver Island. You can go back to episode 4 and you'll find all the information on what took place leading up to that explosion. But obviously that meant that the Tonkin was no longer available. The ship itself, the men who were crewing the ship, the trade goods on the ship, and all the future trade value of the voyages planned for the ship were vaporized in Clayoquot Sound. You know, we talk about opportunity costs in economics, and the opportunity cost means that you don't do one thing so that you can pursue another. And whatever you would have done is an opportunity cost. Well, all the other things that the ship could have done were lost. And now, even though Astor doesn't know it, his entire vision for the American Fur Company, the Pacific Fur Company really, but the American Fur Company was the parent organization, those all were in jeopardy now. It took months for the news of this tragedy to reach Astor, but before it reached him, obviously it was well known by the men at Astoria, and the news hit them within a couple of months of the explosion of the Tonkin. Now, several months later, the news got back to New York, but it would take a lot longer for another voyage to bring more supplies and more men to the outpost on the Pacific coast. That meant that the fort and the trading post at Astoria, although it was built and the relationships with the natives who lived nearby were being developed, those men knew that they were alone. They were on their own. and they didn't know for how long. If you think about this, they were surrounded by potential enemies. The 32 men at the fort knew that they were severely outnumbered by the natives, and they needed to come up with a plan to survive until reinforcements could arrive. Again, they had no idea when those reinforcements might get there. There wasn't a guarantee that they would have reinforcements anytime soon, if at all, and there certainly was no guarantee that any tribe in that area would be peaceful for very long, especially when they realized that they had vastly superior numbers, and that with the overwhelming force that they had, the trade goods at the fort were really there for the taking. Now, there's an old saying that I think fits perfectly in this case. Hope is not a plan. And there were no truer words that have ever been spoken. Another saying I also find useful when you think about solutions to problems comes from General Patton, commander of the United States Third Army in Europe during World War II. Patton famously said, "An imperfect plan, violently executed today, is better than a perfect plan executed next week." Now, the Pacific Fur Company partner and Astoria commander, Duncan McDougall, he came up with what I think is a brilliant and simple plan for dealing with the threat of hostile attack. You could say, in a manner of speaking, that he launched a psychological warfare operation. He employed the threat of biological warfare to keep the natives at bay. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the tribes along the coast of Oregon and Washington had traded with Europeans for decades. A few years earlier, smallpox had spread along the Pacific coastline, and it dealt death to those tribes as it had and would to others across North, Central, and South America. The very idea of that dreaded disease was enough to terrify any of the natives in the area, and McDougall knew that he could take advantage of the greatest short-term motivator in his arsenal: fear. Now, McDougall, thinking that a conspiracy of some sort might be in the works, he pulled together a meeting of several of the chiefs of the various tribes. When they were seated for the meeting, McDougall pointed out what Washington Irving called the treachery of the tribe that attacked the Tonkin, and told the men that although the white men at the fort were few, they had some powerful medicine. It was then that he pulled out a small bottle and held it up for all of them to see, and he said, "See here, in this bottle I hold the smallpox, safely corked up. I have but to draw the cork and let loose the pestilence, to sweep man, woman, and child from the face of the earth." If you recall our earlier episodes, we spoke about how the smallpox decimated the native tribes. Somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of every tribe succumbed to the disease, and the chiefs were terrified of any possibility that that disease might be let loose upon their population. So they begged McDougall not to open the bottle. Each of them vowed that they and their tribes were the friends of the whites and would remain so. McDougall reassured them that the bottle would remain closed as long as the tribes remained peaceful and friendly, and the white men were not attacked. But if any hostility should occur, the cork would come out of the bottle, and the disease would be allowed to work its terrible magic on the tribes. Soon, McDougall had a new name. He became known as the Great Smallpox Chief. Now, meanwhile, the Overland Party was prepping to depart on their expedition, and Wilson Price Hunt had his own problems to contend with. He was in charge of the overland expedition of the Pacific Fur Company, but he had no experience in the field whatsoever. He had spent his entire career in St. Louis supplying Indian traders with the wares that they needed to go into the field, and he had never led an expedition upriver. Since Hunt's expertise lay in conducting the business functions in a trading post, he needed someone who could make up for his deficiencies in what we might call woodcraft, the skills that would be needed to navigate the wilderness, find food, avoid troubles with the Indians, and keep the entire operation headed in the right direction, both figuratively and literally. Hunt's capable partner, Donald Mackenzie, he supplied everything that Hunt didn't have. Now, today, if we want to be successful as leaders, we are reminded that we should surround ourselves with people who complement us and can do the things that we don't do well. Hunt and Mackenzie, like Lewis and Clark before them, made a formidable pair, each supplying part of what was needed for the success of the expedition, but they had yet to really get started. Now, Hunt and Mackenzie arrived in Montreal, the embarkation point from which to procure really everything that they needed for the overland expedition, in July of 1810. The Tonkin would depart for her voyage via Cape Horn in September, and the two parties should each require about 6 to 7 months of travel to reach the mouth of the Columbia, arriving at approximately the same time. Now, we've already examined what happened with the Tonkin, and we know that by the time the Tonkin was blown to smithereens, the overland party had not yet arrived in Astoria. So they were prepping at the same time to each undertake their own voyages or journeys, I should say. And time was wasting for Hunt. He knew that the first order of business was to stock the enormous canoe that he had, which was about 30 to 40 feet long, with all the supplies needed to make their journey. They had to buy ammunition and provisions and trade goods, and they had to combine them, into packs of 90 to 100 pounds each. This process made it a lot easier to handle the supplies when they had to, by necessity, take them ashore or portage them around obstructions in the rivers. And that was really common because at that time, remember, the rivers were not improved at all. There were no dams, there were no man-made lakes. And so every change in elevation from the surrounding topography meant that the river and the streams had to also change elevation. You had frequent waterfalls and whitewater rapids and tight canyons with white water as well. And there are many of those we'll talk about as we go forward. But the next most important and most difficult task was, and it might have been actually the most difficult task, was recruiting enough Canadian voyagers to effectively move down the Mississippi and up the Missouri rivers. Down the Mississippi, not so much of a problem because you're going downstream, but going up the Missouri required a tremendous amount of labor on the part of the voyagers, the boatmen. Now, these men were accustomed to the hardships of poling and paddling, towing, cordelling, and sometimes, if the winds were favorable, sailing up streams and upriver. But most of the time, the power that would be needed to propel those boats upstream was going to come from the muscles and labor of the men on board. Good men in this endeavor would be worth whatever price was required to hire them, and I specify good men. The problem was that the Northwest Company already had a finger on the pulse of the pool of able-bodied voyagers and good men working in Montreal, and they worked behind the scenes secretly to keep the best of them from joining Hunt's expedition. Now, nevertheless, Hunt eventually recruited what he thought would be enough rivermen, and the expedition left Montreal in July of 1810. Now, Hunt soon found out that he had not recruited the cream of the voyager crop. According to Washington Irving, those men who were hanging around Montreal fell into one of three classes. There were some who were able-bodied but inexpert, so they didn't know very much about what would need to take place. Others were expert but lazy. And then the third class would have been those who were expert and they were willing, but they were worn out. Their bodies were broken down. They were not really capable of working as hard, and the physical labor was going to be too much for them. Many of them would have been much older as well. So when you think about those personnel issues and the fact that Hunt had no experience at all working with voyagers, their progress was very slow, and they arrived in Mackinac on July 22nd, 1810. Michilimackinac we discussed back in episode 2, but it had been a trading post and settlement for nearly a century. Hunt wanted to round out his list of supplies at Mackinac, buying additional trade goods, and he hoped finding additional voyagers who would join the expedition west. So for several days he searched for men, but everyone he offered a position turned him down flat. Many of the loafers around the post, and there are always loafers around these types of posts, they were more than happy to talk critically, probably is a good word, to anyone who might express any interest at all, and to quickly talk them out of the notion of going along with Hunt. After all, if you're standing around trying to think of reasons not to go on an expedition like this, there are lots. And those loafers around the posts, they could make some hay with these types of arguments. But eventually, Hunt found a man who signed on, and he used this man as his seed stock, you might say, to induce other people to join. Nevertheless, problems persisted, and when the men signed on, they insisted on negotiating specific terms for themselves. There wasn't a blanket policy you could use to hire people. Some refused the required 5-year contract. Others insisted that at least part of their pay be made in advance, and then they would waste that advance. Then they would return to Hunt again. This happened often, requesting that he pay off some of their debts, which they owed at the Mackinac post, so that they could leave with the expedition. Now you can imagine, I would imagine, that I would be really disgusted with the whole process, and Hunt was. He decided that he had to do something else. There had to be another way to entice better quality people to join his team. And in advertising terms, we might call what he did offering a premium, which is something that you get for free simply by buying the product we're selling. In this case, he noted that most of the voyagers around the post were predisposed to dress conspicuously. They wore feathers and brightly colored clothing. They wanted to stand out. And Hunt began distributing feathers and ostrich plumes to his voyagers, who would then put them in their hats, and they would strut around Mackinac like a banty rooster, to use an old Appalachian saying. Now, I want to note here, when I say Appalachian, it is Appalachian, not Appalachian. I hear a lot of people say Appalachian, and truthfully, it's based upon where you are. But where I'm from, in rural northeast Tennessee, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, it's Appalachian. But anyway, the voyagers willingly played the part of the eager influencer today. In the days before TikTok, these guys going out and wearing these feathers, bragging about being a part of a new company heading to the Northwest. Well, they were able to influence lots of others. And the power of those influencers soon had Hunt equipped with the men he needed to make his journey. Now, it was also here at Mackinac that Hunt was joined by a man whom he had written and personally requested to join the group. Ramsey Crooks, a young Scot who worked in the Northwest Company and had been on his own on some trading expeditions to the tribes of the Missouri, joined at Michilimackinac. Now, Hunt and Crooks were well acquainted, and Hunt judged Crooks to have the right combination of skills and experience to be extremely valuable in his work with the company on this journey. It's always exciting to plan a new endeavor, but Ramsey Crooks, he brought something to the table here that kind of dampened the enthusiasm. He brought those unrealistic expectations for the journey to a halt very quickly. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I'm a fan of Jocko Willink's podcast, and I really can't recommend it too highly. Jocko often offers his opinion on properly establishing expectations, and I think this admonition fits perfectly in the scenario that we see here with Hunt. Here's an example. A common question that Jocko asks, what is the most important thing you need to know on the battlefield? Often gets the answer, you have to know the enemy's location. But Jocko points out that knowing the enemy's whereabouts is really useless if you don't know where you are. Now, this is the most important thing to know. And I think the same thing applies to the figurative location as well as the literal location. So if you aren't sure of where you stand figuratively, psychologically, from a mission standpoint, then you can't tell how to properly proceed. And I'll give another example of the importance of this so that you can let this rattle around in your head, kind of like it does mine. In his book, Good to Great, Jim Collins tells the story of Admiral James Stockdale, a Navy pilot shot down over North Vietnam, who consequently spent 7 years in the notorious Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp. Stockdale, the ranking officer in the prison, was responsible for establishing the culture and maintaining the discipline of the men in captivity there. Now imagine that. You're in prison camp, you're the ranking officer, and you have to help establish and maintain standards for military behavior. His basic premise, though, which became called the Stockdale Paradox in Collins' book, is that in any situation, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves about the number and severity of the problems that we face, while simultaneously never losing the belief that we will triumph in the end. We must know the terrible details, exact details, the complete list of details of the problems that we're facing, whilst at the same time believing in our core that we have the ability, the power, the capabilities to solve those problems and achieve our goals in the end, to conquer those problems. It's a powerful way to think about any situation in life. And for me, I think it's a life-changing way to look at the challenges that we might face. Ramsey Crooks knew the difficulties that the party was facing, and he painted a clear picture of the hardships ahead, stating that any journey into the interior of the plains needed to be made with a force large enough for defense from the unfriendly tribes. They would pass through the Sioux country, and the Sioux were a tribe that had proven more than willing to harass trading parties, and you could expect them to do worse if possible. Crooks himself had been there, and he had his own story about what to expect. In 1809, Crooks and his partner Robert McClellan had established a trading post in what is today's Bellevue, Nebraska. Now, as always, in the days prior to e-commerce, the three most important things for the success of a retail operation are location, location, and location. In this location, the competition was fierce. Manuel Lisa, or the Missouri Fur Company, had a trading post there, and it was well established and well run by Joseph Robideau, the man for whom St. Joseph, Missouri would later be named. As so often happens, the first mover advantage belonged to Lisa's trading post. They had established trading relationships and had treated their trade partners well. And all this meant that Crooks and McClellan had an uphill battle to be profitable in Bellevue. Now, as we might expect, the poor returns from their trading posts led Crooks and McClellan to push upriver. Their wish was to go to the Mandan villages with 2 keelboats and 40 men, relocating the trading post to that area. But near the Great Bend, or Grand Detour of the Missouri River in South Dakota, the flotilla met a party of 600 Teton Sioux, all stationed on the bluffs above the river with weapons covering the men on the boats. The Sioux demanded that the boats turn back downriver, and with no hope of defending themselves from this large party of warriors, the men turned the boats around and drifted downstream to a landing, at which the chiefs stood waiting for them. While most of the men stayed with the boats, Crooks and McClellan went ashore with their interpreter and sat in the semicircle with the chiefs. A red stone pipe with a 4-foot stem decorated with porcupine quills and red-dyed horsehair was brought forward by the pipe bearer. Now, we'll discuss the Pipestone Quarry in Minnesota shortly, but this incident illustrates the importance of the pipe and of ceremony to the tribes on the plains. The pipe bearer lit the pipe, held it toward the sun, and then the 4 points of the compass. The pipe was then passed around to each of the chiefs, Crooks and McClellan, in succession. This smoking indicated that each member of the group was committed to negotiation in good faith during the talks that were to follow. It was during this conversation that the Sioux made it clear any attempt by the men to continue upstream would be met with violence. They also made it clear that while they wouldn't allow the party to continue upstream, the men were welcome to establish a trading post here. Now, the Sioux had at least 2 powerful motives for this sort of negotiation. One, they wanted to remain the intermediaries, carrying these goods farther upriver to more distant tribes and trading with them at a profit. Second, they didn't want the tribes upriver to be able to gain access to the firearms and gunpowder that would help them in their conflicts with the Sioux. Crooks and McClellan also believed that Manuel Lisa had prompted the actions of the Sioux, and both men carried this animosity into their future interactions with Lisa. McClellan even declared openly and often that if he ever saw Lisa in Indian country, he'd shoot him on the spot. Now, after the Sioux stated their position clearly, Crooks and McClellan knew their upstream progress was over, and instead immediately ordered that a trading house be constructed right there at the landing. The Sioux now left for their village 20 miles away, leaving 6 men to watch the traders, just making sure that they were going to stay committed to the enterprise. Crooks and McClellan gave the Sioux time to get to their village, and then they cast off with their keelboats and headed downriver, raising their sails to put on speed. With the favorable wind and the rapid flow of the river, they floated downstream for 5 days and nights without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between them and their interceptors. They finally stopped below Omaha, and they established a trading post at the Nishnabotna River, where Crooks remained until he joined Hunt's expedition. This story highlighted 2 things. Crooks had experience, and the Sioux were no joke. Oh, that reminds me. Did I mention the Blackfeet? No? Well, let's go back and revisit episode 3 and the things that the Blackfeet did to Andrew Henry's men at Fort Raymond, or even John Colter on the banks of the Jefferson River in Three Forks country. They were avowed enemies of the whites, and if only one thing could be counted on during this expedition, it would be the animosity of the Blackfoot tribe. Best to bring as many men as they could on this trip. The number originally limited to 30 was doubled, with the plan to bring on the additional 30 men in St. Louis. After a lengthy stay from July 22nd to August 12th, where Hunt's patience with his rivermen was again tested, the expedition left Mackinac and headed through Green Bay, the Fox and Wisconsin rivers, through Prairie du Chien, and down the Mississippi to St. Louis, landing there on September 3rd, 1810. Washington Irving's description of St. Louis in 1810 is rich and should be read in its entirety when you have a chance. As the last place where a party could outfit for a trip into the wilderness, the people and opportunities to be encountered there were diverse. I'll take a few words from that description now just to give a rough outline of what Hunt's party would have experienced. It possessed a motley population composed of the Creole descendants of the original French colonists, the keen traders from the Atlantic states, the backwoodsmen of Kentucky and Tennessee, the Indians and half-breeds of the prairies, together with a singular aquatic race that had grown up from the navigation of the rivers, the boatmen of the Mississippi, who possessed habits, manners, and almost a language peculiarly their own and strongly technical. All these circumstances combined to produce a population at St. Louis even still more motley than that at Mackinac. Here were to be seen about the riverbanks the hectoring, extravagant, bragging boatmen of the Mississippi, with the gay, grimacing, singing, good-humored Canadian voyageurs. Vagrant Indians of various tribes loitered about the streets, and now and then a stark Kentucky hunter in leathern hunting dress with rifle on shoulder and a knife in belt strode along. I take those descriptions of St. Louis from Washington Irving's book, Astoria. And if you haven't read that book, I suggest you go back and get it. It was first published in 1836. Fantastic, fantastic book. You can find it for free and read it for free on the Internet Archive, archive.org. Now, it's clear in my mind that when Wilson Price Hunt and his party reached St. Louis, it was bustling with activity. We might even call it vibrant. Maybe that's the best word to describe what they would have found when they arrived. They also found a man named Joseph Miller, a former U.S. Army officer from Baltimore who had resigned his commission and had recently been actively trapping and trading with the Indians up the Missouri. He was just the kind of man Hunt needed. Experienced and dependable, Miller joined as a partner in the enterprise. Now here it's important to say that Wilson Price Hunt he's acquired several men, McKenzie, Crooks, and now Miller, who have experience trading on the fringes, the outer edges of the Missouri River. And so he has some people with the expertise that he would have needed there. In addition to Miller, several other men joined the party as trappers or boatmen or hunters, depending upon their background and their skill. And of course, their pay arrangements differed based upon the necessities at the time. Remember, in most cases, they were likely negotiating their own deals, just as those who had come on at Mackinac had negotiated their own deals. Some men earned a salary of $300, others were supplied their outfits and they had their expenses paid, but they were then required to hunt and trap for a share of the proceeds. The Missouri Fur Company of Manuel Liza was powerfully active in St. Louis at this time, and it, along with other trappers working out of St. Louis, for obvious reasons, opposed Hunt's attempts to secure supplies and men. Due to the delays experienced by the expedition since their formation at Montreal, Hunt and the partners knew that they would never be able to complete the trip up the Missouri River in 1810. The weather would become too cold, the river would freeze long before they were able to reach the headwaters, and the northern plains or high mountain rivers, well, they were no place to winter without proper supplies and preparation. And if you did winter there, you were probably going to have to hunker down and just wait the weather out. The expedition couldn't possibly reach its destination, and it couldn't stay in St. Louis. Keeping the men out of trouble had always been difficult, so a winter in town filled with distractions would be no picnic. There was also the expense of supplying the men's food during the winter. Each additional cost was 100% overhead, with no progress towards the mission's goals. And if you'll remember, most of these men had requested some sort of an advance from Hunt, and it was likely they were going to spend that advance and more, and so he was looking at a tremendous amount of overhead if he stayed in town. So on October 21st, 1810, Hunt's expedition departed and they headed upriver. Hunt had decided at this point that he would go as far as possible and that he would choose his winter camp at a location yet to be determined. He didn't know what the location would be, but as with many things in life, he'd know it when he found it. Now, the flotilla took the form of 3 boats. One was a barge brought down from Mackinac, a second was an even larger barge called a Schenectady barge, and the third was a keelboat. Now, the keelboat was the typical Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri River boat used to haul freight. It was essentially a floating container. Before we had container ships, it was a smaller version of that. And the labor supplied by the boatmen and voyagers was absolutely critical to the success of this phase of the trip. Moving upstream into the teeth of a fast-moving river is difficult at the best of times. The Missouri, a murky river, was more than just a strong, fast-flowing stream. During the best of times, the boats could be pushed upriver by sail, but this was very rare. More often, the men had to use poles and tow ropes and cordels, paddles, etc., to push and pull the boats along. It was bone-wearying work, but the men took to it and they pushed on with seeming indifference. Constant vigilance was needed to avoid the floating trees and debris coming down the river. Sawyers, which are trees sunk underwater but with some portion just above waterline or maybe just below, were constant problems. And the river channel shifted from side to side because the river had a continual flow of sediment and debris coming downriver. So there was an endless number of twists and turns even within the channel that had to be navigated by the boats. On November 16, 1810, the expedition reached the mouth of the Nottoway River, and Hunt decided that this was the winter camp they had been looking for. Now, shortly after setting up camp, Robert McClellan, Ramsey Crook's old partner, joined the expedition. McClellan's experience made him an excellent fit for this journey as well. And it's now we see that Hunt has Mackenzie, he has Crooks, he has Miller, and he has McClellan, all experienced men who can head upriver with him. McClellan had served under Mad Anthony Wayne in the Indian Wars in the old Northwest Territory of the Midwest, and one look was all it took to see that he was tough as nails, capable of handling whatever problems came his way. Hunt was glad to have him and eagerly offered a partnership in the enterprise, an offer which was also eagerly accepted by McClellan. Also joining the party was a hunter from Virginia whose name you may have heard even if you've never heard anything about the man himself, John Day. Day had lived for years on the Missouri frontier and had worked for Ramsey Crooks and others during that time. He stood a strapping 6 foot 2 inches tall, and it said that his gait was so smooth that he seemed to be walking on springs. Being about 40 years old at that time, Day boasted that in his younger days nothing could have slowed him down. But his years of hard living had been tough on his constitution. Regardless, John Day was still a first-rate woodsman and hunter, and more importantly, he was a dead shot. He would be a valuable addition to Hunt's group. As soon as things were settled at the Nottoway River camp, Wilson Price Hunt decided that he should return to St. Louis. He needed to recruit an interpreter who knew something of the Sioux Nation, as well as additional able-bodied hunters and riflemen. He was now convinced that he would need all the fighters he could carry into the wilderness, and though he had a substantial number of rivermen and Canadian voyagers, neither of those groups were known for their ability or even their willingness to fight. Hunt departed the camp on New Year's Day, 1811, headed to Fort Osage, his first stop en route to St. Louis. He was accompanied by 8 men to Fort Osage, and there he bought horses and sent most of the men back to Nottoway, but continued on to the city, St. Louis, with 2 of the men who came with him initially. Now, when he reached the city on January 20th, 1812, Hunt found himself in familiar territory, both literally and figuratively. Again, he knew something of the city. He had been there, he had lived there, he had worked there, to be sure. But he also found himself again meeting resistance from the Missouri Fur Company, the same old story. Now, in my mind, this has to be expected. It would be difficult to find blame with anyone who had the power to stack the deck in favor of his own company when possible. And Manuel Lisa was certainly willing to do just that. Besides, the Pacific Fur Company expedition was, at least in theory, competing head-to-head with the Missouri Fur Company for able-bodied men who were willing to head into the wilderness. Although the mission for the 2 companies was dramatically different, I'm sure there was a great deal of distrust between the leaders, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. The first objective of the visit to St. Louis was to find a man who could serve as the interpreter with the Sioux tribe. As it turns out, the man for the job at that time was Pierre Dorian, the son of the man who served as an interpreter with Lewis and Clark. Dorian had served the Missouri Fur Company the previous season, so demand for his service was high, as was his price. Although he was a capable interpreter, like many men on the frontier, Dorian had a serious drinking problem. It was one that had resulted in his owing a significant amount to the Missouri Company at Fort Mandan. While Dorian worked for his company, Manuel Lisa didn't mind his owing a whiskey debt. But as soon as he entered negotiations with Hunt, Lisa made threats against him. Dorian was not a man to be forced into anything, and threatening was not an effective tactic for dealing with him. Even though negotiations took 2 weeks, Dorian was hired by Hunt to be hunter and interpreter at a salary of $300 per year, $200 of which would be paid in advance. And to me, this already sounds like a bad idea. Now, Hunt found that he couldn't relax because no sooner had he resolved the interpreter question than 5 of the men from his Nottoway camp showed up in St. Louis, saying that the partners at the camp had treated them badly. Only 2 of the men could be convinced to return with him. The other 3 spread rumors around town that made recruitment of more men for the expedition increasingly difficult. Ultimately, only 1 hunter showed up on the morning of departure to ascend the Missouri with Hunt and his voyagers. The party was rounded out by Pierre Dorian, who refused to join the expedition without his pregnant Indian wife and 2 children, who boarded the boat as it cast off for the voyage to Nottoway. Hunt had offered the protection of his men to 2 additional travelers. John Bradbury, a botanist from the Linnaean Society of Liverpool, sent out to collect specimens of American plants, and also Thomas Nuttall, a young man from England who would later write Travels in Arkansas. Bradbury and Nuttall placed their trunks on the boat but stayed 1 more night in St. Louis, vowing to catch up to the boat the next day. As it turned out, this was good fortune because that evening these men learned of Manuel Lisa's order to detain Pierre Dorian because of his whiskey debt. Bradbury and Nuttall left St. Louis after midnight, caught up with Hunt's flotilla before it reached St. Louis, and provided enough advance notice for Dorian and his small family to go ashore and head into the woods with a promise to join them upstream later. When the boats reached St. Charles, they were searched to no avail. Pierre Dorian wasn't aboard, and they were allowed to leave and head on upriver. When Dorian did rejoin the party, he was alone. He and his wife had disagreed about something, and he had beaten her, after which she ran into the woods with the children and all the couple's worldly possessions. Now, that's impressive for a pregnant woman. Not to worry, though, she returned the next morning, and the family was reunited, although the problems with Dorian were far from over. On January 17, 1811, Hunt stopped at Charette, an old French colonial village where they met 85-year-old Daniel Boone, who had just brought back almost 60 beaver skins from a trapping trip he'd made upstream. Washington Irving talks about the parting of Boone and Hunt in Astoria, and I can't help but agree with Irving's sentiments. As the men said their farewells, it's likely that Boone wished he were younger so that he could join the group. What's the old poem? Elbow room, cried Daniel Boone. Oh, I'm sure he felt the deep pull of the wilderness, and I'm sure it still called to him. Now, the very next morning, while still in their overnight camp, who should hello the camp and make his way in but John Colter, the first mountain man, who in early summer 1810 had spent 30 days making the 3,000-mile trip down the Missouri River from the Three Forks area alone in a canoe. More than happy to share his insight with the group, Colter spent the morning with them, telling them about the country they would traverse, which was directly through the territory occupied by the Blackfeet tribe. Imagine the stories Colter had to tell, and the warnings he gave to his relatively uninitiated group of travelers. Recently married, Colter was sorely tempted to join the party and head back upstream, but ultimately he decided to honor his vow to never return to the wilderness. Though he had chosen a safe and relatively tranquil life over the dangers of the wild, safety eluded John Colter. He would be dead of jaundice within 2 years. Now, as I wrote this and read about Colter's visit with Hunt's party, I couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like to sit around a fire and hear John Colter tell of his experiences in the Blackfoot country. This is a man who traveled all the way to the Pacific coast, to Astoria, essentially, and back, most of the way back to St. Louis with Lewis and Clark, and then he spent years in the West, walking hundreds of miles across the Rocky Mountains, And dealing with the Blackfeet tribe, as we discussed in other episodes of the Blood and Leather podcast, what it would have been like to have been sitting around that fire and listening to those stories. I just can't imagine how wonderful that would have been. Also, I can't imagine how terrifying that would have been to think about the severity of the difficulty you were going to be facing as you headed into Blackfoot country. Colter would have driven that point home very effectively, I'm sure. Now, on April 8th, 1811, Hunt made it back to Fort Osage and was met there by Ramsey Crooks, who had come down from Nottoway with a boat and 9 men. Lieutenant Brownson had temporary command of the fort, but we will see in the future that this temporary command was temporary for a number of years. And Hunt and the entire party set off and reached the Nottoway River Fort on April 17th, 1811. There they began immediately preparing to start upriver, just as soon as they deemed the Missouri safe from the spring floods. Now, Washington Irving makes note of the fact that both rattlesnakes and pigeons were plentiful in the Nottoway River camp. The rattlesnakes were a nuisance, but the sheer number of the pigeons encountered was incredible. It's said that the migrating flocks of pigeons passing overhead resembled clouds. Descriptions of the now extinct passenger pigeon flocks come to mind, and I assume that this was the species that Irving was referencing here when discussing Hunt's experiences at the Nottoway River camp. They say that the noise generated by a flock which was resting but disturbed and took off in flight, it sounded like rushing water. And the birds, much like the Egyptian locusts that we read about in the Bible, they ate everything in their path. Now, as Hunt's expedition decamped and headed upriver, almost 60 people were in the boats. 5 partners, John Reed, a clerk who's going to be prominent later in our story, 40 Canadian voyagers, several hunters, as well as Pierre Dorian, his wife, and children. Spirits must have been high as they were leaving that winter camp and heading up towards their destination. Nothing seems to invigorate us like the prospect of heading off on a journey, even if it's into the unknown. And they had done the most difficult thing. They'd started. Now, the first 4 or 5 days, they proved easy enough because there was enough wind to propel the boats upstream with sails, and the waters were calm enough that they weren't being driven back downstream. On April 28, 1811, they reached the Platte River, the river destined to be the companion of so many of those who would take the immigrant trails, Mormon, Oregon, and California a few decades later. The Platte River confluence enters the Missouri just south of modern-day Omaha, Nebraska. And the early travelers headed upriver. They considered the Platte to be roughly the halfway point of their journey up the Missouri River. It's about 600 miles from St. Louis. And it was here that the travelers saw signs of war parties that had recently been in the area. And they also witnessed something that we don't think about very much, but they saw the glow of massive wildfires on the prairies. And I misspoke by saying wildfires even, because those prairies west of the mighty Missouri that were on fire had often been set on fire by war parties which were trying to use the fires to mask their trails and to keep potential pursuit from catching up with them. So many of the wildfires on the prairies were actually lit by the Indians who lived there. The group stopped at Papillon Creek to make oars and poles from the ash trees in that area. Papillon, which would be the proper French pronunciation for the word, means butterfly in French. When I lived there, my wife and I lived in Omaha for a while, and it was called Papillion. And in today's world, the Americanization of the word, it's called Papillion today. Hunt was realizing when he made this camp that maintaining an expedition of this size with this number of diverse individuals, well, it was a real headache. And I used to tell my students when I was a professor, I would tell them that the most challenging aspect of business management was dealing with people. There are lots of other things that are challenging, but the most challenging aspect is handling the personalities, the motivations, the problems. the disagreements between diverse peoples. On May 2nd, 1811, the two Harrington brothers let Hunt know that they planned to leave his expedition. Now, one of the brothers, he was experienced as a hunter. He had been in the Missouri River region for a number of years, and the other brother had joined Hunt in March and come upriver to join with his brother, who had camped at Nottoway over the winter. Unfortunately, the newly arrived brother, he had joined the expedition, been asked to join the expedition by their mother with the express purpose of finding his brother and bringing him back home. So his enlistment in the cause had been only to find his brother and to bring his brother back. Their mom was getting nervous about the nature of the expedition, and as mothers often do, she wanted those boys back under her watchful eye. Now, Hunt tried to reason with these men. He let them know that they would need to travel almost 700 miles back to St. Louis, but he couldn't get through. It was to no avail. And sensing that allowing anyone to leave the party too easily could trigger even more desertions, Hunt, who was kind of angry about the entire affair anyway, left them on the riverbank to find their way back without lead or powder or any other form of assistance. Sometimes it's lonely at the top. On May 7th, the boats encountered numerous signs of war parties in the area. If you'll remember, they had first encountered signs of war parties back around the confluence of the Platte River. That night, a wild yell aroused the camp. Before the men could take any action, 11 naked Sioux warriors charged into the camp, tomahawks at the ready. Imagine the spectacle. The Sioux were quickly captured and their weapons seized, and their leaders during this whole process were telling the men not to resist. Now, despite their claims of peaceful intentions, Hunt discovered that they were members of the war party whose signs they had been seeing for some time. Pierre Dorian explained that sometimes in times of desperation, a war party that had not been successful might seek to do something drastic. The braves might cast off their clothes to demonstrate their dedication to the Great Spirit, and they would pray for success during these times. And it was at times like this, when the braves were desperate for some sort of success, that they might be reckless in their actions. They might do something like streaking into a group of armed men who outnumbered them 6-1, with only their tomahawks at the ready. Now, while some of the men in the party wanted to kill the Sioux outright, obviously those Indians were intent on doing harm to them. Hunt preferred a moderate approach, and he had the braves transported across the river, threatening them with death if they were involved in any hostility. The expedition continued to travel north, and now, about 800 miles from St. Louis, landed at the Omaha Village on May 10th, 1811. The Omaha Village contained somewhere around 80 lodges, and we might call them teepees, each about 16 feet in diameter. Because each of the tribes on the plains had a somewhat different approach to placing the support poles and skins, as well as decorating their lodges, a person knowledgeable in such things could tell which tribe was encamped simply by the style and decorations on the lodges. After watching old westerns, which we know must be true, I always wondered how a quick glance at an Indian camp could reveal the tribe. Who knew? As with other Plains tribes, the Omaha were a shadow of the tribe they had been. The Plains tribes could never be confused with peaceful farming villages, for the most part, although there was some agriculture practiced in places like the Mandan villages. And tribes like the Sioux, the Pawnees, the Sacs, the Kansas, and others were constantly at war with the Omaha. Smallpox had also found these people in about 1802, taking nearly 70% of the tribe before the dust settled. And because of this decimation, in May 1811, the tribe numbered only about 200 warriors and hunters. I marvel at those poor, misguided people who think that the Indian tribes in the Americas lived in peaceful harmony with each other. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Hunt wrote John Jacob Astor and described the reality of the tribes along the Missouri River. Their existence was tenuous at best. Constantly at war with each other, they often sacked entire villages, massacring everyone other than those they carried away to slavery, and burning everything they couldn't carry or use. Anyone who was out alone was at risk of being captured or killed as a random event, and there simply was no safety. And this is something we're going to see repeatedly as we move west with different tribes. The Omaha did have an interesting oral tradition, and I think it's one worth repeating. Their former chief, Washingosaba, also called Blackbird, was the subject often discussed. Blackbird was the chief of the tribe when white traders first started coming into the Missouri River country. As a leader of a strong tribe, Blackbird levied a tax on any traders who came into the village or upriver to trade. He chose the best of everything without offering any sort of payment. He did, however, have a way to reward the traders. Once Blackbird had chosen the items he wanted, the traders were free to trade with the rest of the tribe. But there was no negotiation because Blackbird insisted that the tribe pay the prices set by the white traders, whatever those prices might be. Now, in this way, Blackbird's own merchandise was subsidized by the payments of his tribe. You can imagine this arrangement suited Blackbird and the traders just fine, but it didn't sit well with the tribe, the people who were actually paying the Blackbird tax, you might say, and they began to grumble about it. But Blackbird had a proverbial ace in the hole. In the course of business, one of the white traders had introduced Blackbird to a toxin called arsenic, and he provided a supply and gave some instruction to the chief in how to use it effectively. Now, suddenly, Blackbird could foretell death, and anyone who questioned him too vehemently was met with the prophecy of his demise, which, of course, Blackbird could quietly bring about himself. After this, not too many people had bad things to say about Blackbird. Simply brilliant. Now, Blackbird could be a deadly enemy in more than one way. As a warrior, he must have been nearly unequaled. He was said to have been over 6 feet tall, quite large for the time, and tempered by the hardship of being captured by the Sioux as a young man. He was unrelenting in protecting his tribe from attack, and he acquired a reputation as a military leader. When the Ponca war party carried off some women and horses, Blackbird vowed to eat up the Ponca nation, meaning to destroy them completely. When surrounded, the Ponca chief sent out a warrior carrying a peace pipe. He was shot down. Another warrior was sent out, and he was shot down. And finally, in a move that would have made even the most sophisticated European ruler proud, the Ponca chief sent out his beautiful daughter. Now Blackbird accepted both the pipe and the hand of the maiden, making her his wife and establishing peace between the two tribes. All went well for some time, but as often happens between husband and wife, there was trouble in paradise. Blackbird was accustomed to having absolute power, and as we all know, absolute power tends to have an effect on you. Some people say absolute power corrupts absolutely. In a fit of rage over some perceived slight, Blackbird stabbed and killed his beautiful wife. And when he realized what he had done, he was inconsolable, pulling his buffalo robe over his head and sitting in silence beside her body. He refused to eat and was thought to be starving himself to death out of grief. After some time, a warrior brought in a small child, laid it on the ground, and placed the chief's foot on the throat of the child. Sensing the message implied by this action, Blackbird threw off his robe and seemed to also throw off his grief. The chief continued to lead the tribe effectively until his own death in 1802, a victim of the smallpox epidemic I mentioned earlier. An epidemic like this must have been terrifying to the native tribes. Villages were burned and even wives and children killed rather than have them succumb to the agonizing death inflicted by the disease. It would have been a type of hell on earth. Before he died, Blackbird let it be known that he wanted to be buried atop a 400-foot-high knoll, which represented a commanding view of the broad Missouri River. He had kept a watchful eye on this river for years, waiting for the white traders who would come to enrich both he and his tribe. And the specific hill, according to Washington Irving's account, would, because of the twists and turns of the Missouri, provide a view of the river for roughly 30 miles of travel. Now the Omaha chief could watch from this vantage point forever. As a part of the burial process, Blackbird's favorite warhorse was sacrificed and buried with him. Seated on his favorite horse, both man and steed were buried beneath a mound of earth on top of the hill. And when Hunt's party passed this portion of the river in 1811, a staff which held a tribal banner and the scalps collected by Blackbird during his life was still evident on the burial mound. Today, you can look at Google Maps and find Blackbird Hill just off of US 75 between Decatur and Macy, Nebraska, at a place Google calls Anderson Township. Now, Blackbird's scenic overlook is nearby, as are the Blackbird Ivy Island Wildlife Area and the Blackbird Bend Wildlife Management Area. I think the chief would be pleased to know that he, or at least his name, hasn't been forgotten. I think it's interesting to point out here another thing. All along the Missouri River, the massive spring floods have altered the river almost constantly. So I encourage you to take a moment and look at the Blackbird Hill area on Google Maps. Notice the old riverbed on the Iowa side of the river in what is labeled the Badger Lake State Wildlife Management Area. Now, this is only one of many such places along the river where the channel has changed dramatically. Just 38 miles north of this location is the site of Sergeant Charles Floyd's grave in Sergeant Bluff, Iowa. Floyd was the only member of Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery to die on the expedition, passing away from what is believed to have been peritonitis after a ruptured appendix. His grave had to be moved twice because of erosion of the riverbank, and he's now buried on a bluff overlooking the river. His grave, moved the third time in 1901, is marked with a 100-foot obelisk as a monument. Lewis and Clark thought so highly of Floyd that they named a river just north of his grave, Floyd River. But I digress. We've left Hunt and his party at the Omaha Village, and we need to move them on upstream as soon as possible. The visit with the Omahas provided an opportunity for 3 Yankton Sioux to bring an update on the Teton Sioux who lived upriver. Irving's description of this tribe was as a sort of pirates of the Missouri, and it sounds as though he was accurate. The Tetons had a history of trading with the Northwest Company, so they had no need for establishing friendly relations with the Americans who were coming up the Missouri to trade. In fact, they looked at these expeditions much like Sir Francis Drake would have looked at a Spanish galleon. The Tetons could, and would, descend on these trading parties with a vengeance, taking whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Some thought that this was instigated by the British traders, but it's clear to me that although this might be true, the opportunity to steal these goods was really all the motivation the Tetons needed. Another legitimate reason for the tenacity of the Tetons was the importance they placed on being the trade intermediaries for the tribes which lived farther upriver. Now, we talked about that earlier. In 1809, these concerns had led them to stop Crooks and McClellan from establishing a trading post at the Mandan villages. We've all heard the catchphrase, eliminate the middleman, and we know that that applies to eliminating one of the levels in the distribution channel, which results in lower prices for the final consumer. Maybe. As the middlemen, the Teton wielded negotiating and political power in their relationships with the upriver tribes. They could control the price of trade goods, and even more importantly, they could control the supply of the types and quality and quantity of weaponry supplied to those tribes. Put yourself in their moccasins, and it's easy to see that you might go to great lengths to protect your lifestyle. Now, meanwhile, the attitudes of Hunt's men had become toxic. Men of action can't sit around and wait for things to happen. When they do, you can bet that something will happen, but it isn't going to be what you want. Rumors and loose talk start to run wild, and if there's a lack of real news on the progress of the enterprise, well, the men will simply make up worst-case scenarios and pass them along. And while Hunt and his men were staying in the Omaha village, rumors of the Sioux grew large and rampant. The Canadian voyagers didn't sign on for this sort of danger, and the courage of many started to falter. 3 men deserted, but there happened to be 3 men in the village who could and did replace them. And when they were offered an acceptable wage and furnished with the outfit needed to be members of the party, they joined. For his part, Hunt was ready to get moving. He knew that the only way to reduce the temptation to desert was to put more miles between his expedition and any organized settlement. The farther upriver they went, the lower the probability that his men would leave. Few men would want to traverse hostile country alone to return to the Omaha village or another trading post or even a settlement farther downstream. Putting miles between himself and the Omaha village would dampen his men's enthusiasm for leaving the party, and that could only be good for Hunt in the long run. Hunt's expedition left the Omaha village on May 15, 1811, making good progress due to fair winds that allowed the boats to easily, or as easily as possible at least, move up the Missouri. As they traveled, rising water indicated that the spring thaws were happening in the foothills of the mountains. The melting snow and ice, coupled with early spring rains, gradually added to the volume of water in the Missouri, causing the river to rise, pick up speed, and increase the difficulty of traveling upstream. The men knew that they could no longer hunt safely unless they were doing so on the islands that were frequently found in the middle of the river. One day the men hunted and killed 3 buffalo and 2 elk on a small island. After pausing for their meal, the men had no sooner cast off and headed upstream than they saw a canoe coming downstream. Now, this is where we start to have a little feeling of deja vu all over again. After all, how many times have we spoken of men who were heading back to civilization, dead set on leaving the mountains, only to change their minds when they encountered a party heading back upriver? The two men in this canoe were no different. Benjamin Jones and Alexander Carson were experienced trappers and hunters. They were returning after spending 2 years near the headwaters of the Missouri. The magnetic pull of the wilderness must have been strong for these men, for they were soon on board the expedition's boats, and they were headed back upriver, just like John Colter had done back in August of 1806. The scientists on the expedition were another issue altogether. Nuttall was all business, sometimes heading off alone across the prairie, heedless of the potential dangers in the area. He frequently went exploring and looking for specimens, and was nowhere to be found when the boat was ready to cast off. Somewhat like an absent-minded professor, he'd get lost in the work, and someone would need to go bring him back. Bradbury, on the other hand, he seemed to fit in well with the men on the boats. He liked the active lifestyle that the expedition offered him, and he was ready to go on any excursion for almost any reason. On May 22nd, Bradbury noticed that the river had a large bend, winding in such a way as to take most of the 23rd to travel around and back within a very close distance, creating a sort of small peninsula. As I noted earlier, the course of the river has changed considerably, but I think this bend must be in the area around the mouth of the White River. The distance by river around the peninsula is about 9 miles. Overland, Bradbury would need to walk about 2 miles to meet the boats on the other side. Bradbury decided that walking across the peninsula was exactly the opportunity to look around while on land with relatively little danger. And although reluctant, Hunt agreed to allow the naturalist to set off afoot. You can probably guess that things didn't quite go as planned. Bradbury set off on May 23rd, excited to see the flora and fauna of the prairie on his own terms. He had an easy day's passage across the narrow peninsula before him, and plenty of time to make the journey. Along the way, he watched a group of prairie dogs in a prairie dog town and even took a couple of shots at them. I continued to marvel at the number of times men shot at animals simply to be shooting at them. But the shots did no damage, luckily. He did, however, make a lot of noise, and if you'll recall, the Teton Sioux are just like the weasel in those old Foghorn Leghorn cartoons. They're close by. By mid-afternoon, Bradbury was standing on the riverbank, keeping a sharp eye out for the boat, when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Now, I can only imagine how startled he must have been. I probably would have jumped out of my skin at that point. Not only did he feel the hand on his shoulder, but he turned around, and there was an Indian with the bow drawn back and an arrow pointed at Bradbury's chest. Now, whether he was stunned or not, we have to give Bradbury some credit here. He leveled his rifle at the Indian's chest, immediately, finger at the ready. The bow was pulled back a little farther, and then, just as things were headed for the ultimate showdown, Bradbury started to think. He started to not just react, he started to reason. If the Indian had wanted to kill him, well, he'd already be dead. There must be more to this than met the eye. So taking his hand off his rifle, he reached out to shake hands. The Indian did the same, and the situation took a turn for the best. As it turned out, this was not a Teton Sioux warrior, but rather a Ponca. Yet the situation was not entirely harmless, because 2 other warriors came running up and grabbed Bradbury, trying to get him to head off across the prairie with them. He refused, but handed them a pocket compass, trying to distract them, get their mind off of taking him along with them. They looked at the compass for a few minutes, and then they grabbed him again. He again refused and handed them a microscope, which they also examined for a few minutes. Just as they started to tire of this new magic, one of the warriors jumped up and gave a whoop. Bradbury was back on the defensive, but he quickly realized that the Indian had seen the mast of one of the boats from the expedition. The warriors took advantage of the opportunity and quietly slipped away before the boats arrived to pick up Bradbury. But they hadn't seen the last of the Poncas. The next morning, May 24th, the 3 Poncas were back, and they brought some friends. With them were several members of their tribe, along with one white man. The white man quickly explained that he had a letter for Hunt from Manuel Lisa. Lisa was headed back up the Missouri as a partner and field agent for the Missouri Fur Company. Another partner, Andrew Henry, had abandoned the fort at the Three Forks area in Montana and was at Fort Henry on Henry's Fork of the Snake River in present-day Idaho. Now, Lisa didn't know all of this just yet, but he was headed upriver searching for Henry. Although he had left St. Louis 3 weeks after Hunt, Liza had driven hard to overtake Hunt's expedition, having reached the Omaha village only 4 days after Hunt's departure. The risk of passing the Teton Sioux in smaller groups was too large, and Liza sought the added security of combining their groups until they passed this dangerous section of the river. Now Liza wanted Hunt to wait for him so that they could discuss the situation and plan to ascend the river together. What Hunt didn't know was that Liza did fear Hunt's preceding him upriver. Liza believed that Hunt might be planning to talk his way through the Teton Sioux by explaining that Liza, an old trading partner, was coming behind him with a large supply of the very trade goods that the tribe wanted. Liza also thought that it was just possible that Crooks and McClellan would plant the seed for his own destruction with the Sioux, just as those partners thought Liza had done back in 1809. Now, as far as we know, Crooks and McClellan had no plans to do these types of things, although McClellan was still planning on shooting Liza as soon as he met him on Indian land. But the story told by Crooks and McClellan poisoned Hunt's perception of Liza. Now he felt that he had reason to suspect Liza, who had always been working diligently to block him from hiring men for the expedition in St. Louis anyway. Suspicion was running wilder than the Indians, and neither group thought they could trust the other. And now that we understand the state of mind of the major players, we can perhaps better understand Hunt's actions next. He sent a message back to Liza stating that he would be waiting at the Ponca village. Yet as soon as that messenger started back to Liza, Hunt started pushing harder upriver, stopping only briefly at the Ponca village to purchase some dried buffalo meat before driving to put some distance between the two parties. Now, from my perspective, it's interesting because obviously Hunt could not travel as fast as Manuel Liza. So for Hunt to think that he was going to be able to outdistance Liza on this section of the river seems madness to me. So he's setting himself up for even more trouble down the road in my mind. Somehow, Hunt thought that there was less danger in going through the lands of the Teton Sioux with a smaller party, less men, than in dealing with Manuel Liza. Heading deeper into that territory occupied by the Teton Sioux didn't come without a lot of danger, and Hunt and his men knew that. The Poncas had given them all a healthy dose of pessimism, and the effects lingered as the expedition moved north. Some of the men were more shaken than others, and the men who had joined at the Omaha village and had been outfitted with all the gear they would need for the expedition deserted during the first night's camp. Now, at this point, it becomes increasingly clear why these men were in the Omaha village to begin with. They didn't have the fortitude to make the journey into the wilderness, and they were all too keen to take advantage of the opportunity to equip themselves at the expense of someone else before deserting the party. Human nature being what it is, it's always been difficult to find good help, and Hunt's staffing problems would continue to plague him. Although a search was conducted, the deserters got away without detection, and they aren't mentioned again in any of the records that I've seen. The morning of the second day after leaving the Ponca village, May 26th, the expedition was enjoying a breakfast on the banks of the Missouri when they noticed two canoes descending the river. 2 white men were in one of the canoes, and 1 white man was in the other. Here we go again. Some members of the expedition fired a rifle to attract the attention of the men to their location on the bank, and soon the 2 canoes pulled to shore at the camp. The 3 men in this little flotilla were all hunters from Kentucky, and they're going to be with us for a while. Although you may never have heard of them, they played a pivotal role in some significant events that are coming up. Edward Robinson, at 66 years of age, likely the oldest man in the camp at that time, and likely the oldest person that we will deal with for the entirety of our stories here. He had been an early settler in Kentucky, and he had the scars to prove it. He'd fought several battles with Indians on the frontier, and had even been scalped at one point. Although he had lived through the horrific event, he now wore a handkerchief over his head to cover and protect himself. Not much is known of the other 2 men, John Hoback or Jacob Astor, but it became clear over time that the 3 men stuck together. Having spent a few years on the upper Missouri with Andrew Henry, they had just come back downriver from Henry's fort. They were now determined to head back to St. Louis before continuing to their homes in Kentucky. The sight of this huge party of traders, trappers, voyagers, and hunters, armed and well supplied, all seemingly anxious to continue their journey, must have inspired envy in the hearts of the 3 homeward bound travelers. Repeating a pattern that we've already established, the men who had been moving downriver towards civilization were charmed by the possibilities of such a grand and glorious undertaking as Hunt's expedition represented. Soon, they had negotiated employment, agreeing to hunt and trap for Hunt in return for a complete outfit and a promise to keep them well supplied in all that they needed. Half of their trapping catch would be turned over to the company, while they could sell the other half at the going price, and back upriver they would go. Now Hunt had something he hadn't had when he planned or started his expedition. He had men who had been there. They had been on the Continental Divide. They had crossed the Rocky Mountains. They had seen the Western Slope. They had fought the Blackfeet and were familiar with the Snake and the Crow tribes. They knew the mountain passes, at least so far as they had traversed them, and they could provide that valuable information, serving as guides. Hunt had planned on following the trail of Lewis and Clark on his trip to the Columbia River, but upon consulting with his new subject matter experts, he was cautioned against it. This route went through the heart of the territory occupied by the ruthless and relentless Blackfoot tribe. Now, we've seen what this tribe did to John Colter and to Andrew Henry's men. John Colter had spoken to Hunt about these problems, and now he had Robinson, Hoback, and Resner in his camp telling him the same types of things. The Blackfeet were no easier on other tribes in the area as well. They staged regular raids and they wreaked havoc with a ferocity that we probably can't really understand today. If the Teton Sioux offered a real threat to the expedition, the Blackfeet offered an impenetrable wall. No one would travel through their country without invoking the wrath of the tribe. To try to pass through their country now would be suicide. Instead, Robinson, Hoback, and Resner recommended traveling a path that lay to the south. The passes they recommended lay at the headwaters of the Platte and Yellowstone rivers and offered an easier route which teemed with game, an absolute necessity for a party that would need to feed itself off of the country much of the time. But following their suggested route would mean a change in the mode of transportation, and soon. The Missouri would have to be abandoned at the Arikara village, which was only a few days upstream. This tribe had the horses that would be needed to move across the prairie and into the mountains overland. After discussion with the new guides and with other members of the expedition, Hunt made the decision to follow the suggested route, and everyone felt reinvigorated to know that a change in the routine was soon to take place. They just had to get to the Arikara village. Hunt continued upstream in what is described by Washington Irving as a veritable paradise. The colored flowers of the plains, islands in the river which offered a chance to hunt and camp, grapevines in the trees, rose bushes bursting with flowers, buffalo, elk, antelope. All these were a part of what might have been an idyllic scene had it not been for the threat of Indians around each bend. Deposits of iron ore were seen in the banks of the river where erosion had done the mining. One 15-mile-long stretch of river contained a streak of rust about 100 yards wide, the evidence of a rich iron ore deposit in that area. The only trees anywhere on the prairies were in the riverbed and on the islands themselves. Otherwise, the plains opened into a wide vista of grass and flowers, seemingly flat and stretching as far as the eye could see. Now, I say seemingly flat because anyone who has been there knows that this appearance is misleading. There are hills and valleys on the prairies which would hide a whole tribe of Teton Sioux, and the men in the expedition knew this. As we might expect, these cautious travelers were not about to ascend the Missouri without further hardship, and on the morning of May 31st, 1811, 2 Indians appeared on a bluff overlooking but across the river, and they hailed the camp. The message was not discernible, so Hunt and Pierre Dorian crossed the river to have a parley. One of the Indians mounted up and rode away at full speed. The other met briefly with Hunt and Dorian, who then crossed back to the expedition, standing on the opposite bank. The 2 warriors had been scouts from a large war party, supposedly 280 lodges and over 600 warriors from the Yankton, Teton, Brule, and Miniconjou Sioux tribes. While this would be more than enough warriors to make for a really bad day, they were expecting to be joined by 2 additional tribes. They'd been waiting for 11 days with the primary purpose of stopping Hunt's expedition from proceeding upriver. They made it clear that they wouldn't allow trading with the Arikara, the Mandan, and the Minatari tribes. And while this was terrible news, as the saying goes, the only way out is through. So Hunt pushed the expedition onward. As they rounded a large island, they saw a massive number of warriors riding down the hills to the river. All decorated for war, these men must have been an awe-inspiring sight. They were even more so, because they soon lined up along a point in the river, making it clear that they were marking the northernmost extent of Hunt's journey. Hunt and his men had a decision to make. Should they make a fight for this, or should they turn back? Taking stock of his position, remember, the most important thing to know on the battlefield is your own situation or position. Hunt decided to fight. 60 fighting men, all well armed with plenty of ammunition, provided a pretty significant fighting force. They also had a swivel gun and 2 howitzers, which were quickly loaded and discharged in an attempt to dampen the enthusiasm of the warriors. And these weapons were then reloaded and made ready to inflict as much damage as possible when the time came. The men on the boats now pulled across the river while the Indians watched. The men who weren't engaged in moving the boats picked up their rifles and leveled them at the warriors as they moved within range of the weapons. When the men stood in the boats to fire, the Indians held their buffalo robes out in front of themselves and then spread them on the ground. Recognizing this as a sign of peace and a request to parley, Pierre Dorion yelled for the frontiersmen to hold their fire. A group of about a dozen of the leading warriors came down, and after coming to the edge of the river, lit a fire, sat down around it, and invited Hunt and his men to come smoke the pipe with them. After a quick meeting, Hunt and his partners decided a meeting sounded just fine. After all, what was the alternative? Thus, determined to move forward with diplomacy rather than a test of military strength, Hunt, Mackenzie, Crooks, Miller, McClellan, Bradbury, and Dorion went ashore and took their seats around the fire. The red ceremonial pipe, complete with a 6-foot stem and tufts of horsehair dyed red, was brought forward and lit by the pipe bearer. He then held the pipe towards the sun and towards the 4 cardinal points of the compass before handing it to the principal leader of the Sioux. Now, we've already seen the significance of the pipe smoking ceremonies in every movie in which there's some sort of meeting to negotiate a treaty. After all, there's a reason for the old cliche smoking the peace pipe. But it was a serious ceremonial undertaking requiring a specific instrument. And in my mind, this instrument deserves just a bit of detail and explanation. In 1835, painter George Catlin visited Wisconsin and Minnesota, spending his time there painting the Ojibwa and Santee Sioux. On a return visit the next year, he intended to find the sacred red stone quarry on the Coteau de Prairie, or Hill of the Prairies, a plateau in eastern South Dakota, southwestern Minnesota, and northwestern Iowa. This plateau is 100 miles wide and 200 miles long, and it forms the eastern border of the Missouri River Plain in that area. This quarry was sacred to many tribes, offering a place for them to obtain the red clay stone that they used for making their ceremonial pipes, the centerpiece for their religious and diplomatic ceremonies. According to the legends, no white man had ever seen the quarry, and Catlin was stopped by a band of Sioux who warned him to turn back. Somehow, Catlin convinced the tribe to allow him to visit the site, create some sketches and paintings, and remove some of the sacred stone which he carried as samples. The stone, which is a type of metamorphosed mud or clay stone, was red because of the iron oxide spread through it. And although it appeared in Sioux quartzite, a type of ancient bedrock formed about 1.6 billion years ago, the red stone is easier to carve than the quartz. Though easy to carve, the stone is durable enough that it doesn't crack when you heat it. It can hold intricate designs, and it can be smoothed, and it looks beautiful when finished. When Catlin took his samples to a mineralogist, the unique nature of the stone earned it a brand new name, Catlinite. Colonel Henry Inman, a U.S. Army officer who served on the plains, talked extensively of the ceremonial pipe and the pipestone quarry in his book The Old Santa Fe Trail, published in 1897. The method of holding, smoking, and passing the pipe, according to Inman, was somewhat individualized, with everyone having his own opinion on how these things should be done. Regardless of the details, the tribes used the pipe as a sacred tool to summon the attention of the Great Spirit. The pipe is such a part of the Indian's life that it is even buried with him. Colonel Inman says he has encountered the red Catlinite pipes in the most remote areas in which he was stationed in the United States. Everywhere north, east, south, or west, there he found Catlinite ceremonial pipes. This pipestone was mined for thousands of years. The quarry is a sacred gathering place for tribes from all over North America, a demilitarized zone where violence and age-old feuds were not allowed to interfere with the sacred nature of the quarry. The site was an intersection of trade, and the pipestone was mined and traded across vast trade networks in the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Northern Plains, Central and Southern Plains, Rocky Mountains, Upper Missouri, eastern woodlands, the southeast, and the southwest. All over the country, the Catlinite was traded. When the smoking in this instance was finished, Hunt made a speech in French, which was then interpreted by Pierre Dorion. Hunt here made it clear that the expedition was crossing the prairies with the intent of reaching the Pacific Ocean. They had no intention of establishing trading relationships with the tribes upstream beyond what was going to be needed to acquire the horses and food that they would need to continue their trip. They didn't plan on stopping for long anywhere short of their destination, and Hunt admitted that he had heard rumors about the Sioux' willingness to stop the expedition. But he clearly stated that although peace was his goal, and he had no intention of starting any hostilities, he intended to continue no matter what the cost. To show goodwill, he ordered that tobacco and corn be brought from the boat and offered as token of his peaceful intentions. The Sioux chief seemed satisfied with the gifts, reiterating that the goal of the Sioux was to prevent weapons and ammunition from reaching the upstream tribes with whom the Sioux were at war. Given the circumstances, the Sioux agreed to allow the expedition to continue, and the crisis was averted. Nevertheless, the chief advised the party to camp for the night on the opposite side of the river. He had some young warriors who might not be constrained so easily, and he didn't want trouble. And with that, I think it's time to end episode 5 of the Blood and Leather podcast. I had originally intended to cover all of Hunt's expedition to the Pacific, but this journey is so full of interesting and relevant points that I had to share the ones I find most relevant. In researching this episode, I loved finding out that Hunt met both Daniel Boone and John Colter on his second trip upriver. I'd never heard that before. And the machinations of the Missouri Fur Company versus the American Fur Company downplayed in this episode. They're going to be reintroduced in episode 6. Episode 6 will cover Hunt's overland expedition on horseback through the Rocky Mountains and the brutal circumstances of their advance across the barren landscape of south central Idaho. It is quite a trip, and something that I had not really understood until I started this research. I hope you'll subscribe and stick with me to hear about the remainder of Hunt's journey west. I do want to take a moment to remind you of a very worthwhile resource available for free on the internet. The Internet Archive, which is available at archive.org, has a wealth of books and other materials that we can access at no cost. If you are a student of any sort of material and want to learn more about whatever that subject might be, this is a valuable site. I simply would not be able to find the diversity of resources that I've found for this podcast if not for the Internet Archive, and I can't recommend it too highly. Although you can access the materials for free, the Internet Archive is a nonprofit organization which needs funds to continue to deliver these valuable reference materials. I would ask that you please join me in contributing to this worthwhile cause. Sadly, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Blood and Leather podcast, but I'll be back in 2 weeks with episode 6. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing, contributing to the cause in any way that you deem appropriate. I would appreciate it if you'd head over to my Patreon page, patreon.com, Blood and Leather, and become a member of the page. I'll try to be posting additional content, offering up some behind-the-scenes videos and insight into what I post in the podcast and other materials as I discover ways to add value. Of course, any support you can offer is certainly appreciated. And until I see you again, take care of yourselves and endeavor to persevere.